save rather a good bit of time, at the end for any questions, any dialogue that we want to have. So my comments will be reasonably brief on the front end, and hopefully we can engage in a conversation after I've had a chance to lay out sort of a framework. So let me do a quick screen share. As quick as I wanted it to be. Okay, so here. So can everyone see the opening slide?
Yes, we can.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
Yes, we can.
Okay.
Yes,
So,
we can.
thanks. What I would like to start off with is talk a little bit about where we came from in online dispute resolution and where we are going with online dispute resolution. So I'll go back to what I call the big bang of ODR, which was back in 1992 when the National Science Foundation opened up commerce on the internet and allowed for there to be economic activity on the internet. That almost automatically led to online dispute resolution, because the only way that you have to adjudicate or to mediate or to facilitate disputes that occur in an e-commerce environment is if you use technology which created the dispute to help resolve the dispute. The way I've always said it, if you have a buyer in Lagos and a seller in California, the only reasonable way they can deal with a conflict is to do that in an e-commerce ODR environment. And of course, the initial sort of poster child for ODR was eBay. And now eBay is still in existence, obviously, but around the world, there are literally millions and millions and millions of cases every year that go through an e-commerce ODR platform. ODR evolved over the years into ODR in the courts. Now, this made sense to me. I've been dealing with ODR, I've been dealing with technology and integrating technology into dispute resolution systems since the mid-1990s. And there are two things about the courts and e-commerce that I think almost naturally pull together the technology that's being used to resolve disputes in both realms. For one thing, the numbers. I've very often referred to e-commerce and the courts as being wholesale dispute resolution venues. And what I mean by that is that they are repetitive, massive numbers of repetitive conflicts. If you're in an e-commerce environment, there are only so many things that can go wrong. You know, I didn't get the item, it was broken when I got it, you know, things of that nature. And there are only so many things that I can do to fix it. I can give you a new one, I can give you your money back, things of that nature. In the courts, it's also a semi-bounded universe. The conflicts are not exactly the same every time, but they occur in the same venues. And so if it's a divorce mediation, it's in divorce court, and there are rules there about how you handle it. If it's a small claims, it's in small claims court, and there are rules about how you handle that. And the upshot of that for practitioners who deal with mediation and facilitation and arbitration is that in the courts and in e-commerce, the ODR systems have developed to assume that there is a certain similarity in the cases that come through, so that you can develop augmented intelligence or artificial intelligence systems or algorithms that help you deal with those. And you can put them into a system so that they are handled the same time after time after time. That's what I refer to as wholesale online dispute resolution. The problem is that all along there have been private practitioners who are not dealing with wholesale disputes. I call this retail dispute resolution. You know, if my practice, for example, I do a lot of mediation of labor disputes, and they're very different. They're more complicated than e-commerce disputes, and there are multiple ways that they can be resolved. I think many of you probably, you have your practices as mediators, arbitrators, facilitators, you're not dealing with millions of cases, and you're probably not dealing with thousands of cases, but you're dealing with cases that are of themselves interesting and which come to you and are unique in some sort of way. But all along, there have been these private practitioners, and the development of ODR practice and the development of ODR technology has tended to be dominated by the e-commerce and the court systems. And it's no great mystery about why that is. That's where the money is, and that's where all the cases are. But it doesn't really help a private practitioner who is getting ready to work with parties who may or may not have ever been in mediation before, who are coming in not knowing what to expect, and have a reasonably unique case that they're going to present to the mediator that they're working with. And so one of the challenges that I've been thinking about and trying to face is how do you approach online dispute resolution? How do you describe it? How do you teach it? How do you develop for it for practitioners who are not in wholesale retail or wholesale practice, who are dealing with traditional dispute resolution practices where people come to you with a unique problem and you try to help them solve it. And I will say that there's a book coming out in the next couple of months that I've just written that I think is the only how-to book for private practitioners in online dispute resolution. It's a step-by-step guide on how do you do this well. As a colleague of mine said back when COVID started, COVID has made us all use technology. The challenge is that we all need to learn how to use it well and use it to the benefit of our parties. And so what I've tried to do with the book that I have coming out is to address, what do I do if I'm an individual mediator or arbitrator? How do I prepare myself to choose technology, to present that technology to the parties, and to conduct that session in a way that is going to be useful for the parties and for me, is going to be ethical as I practice, and is going to be good, quote, retail dispute resolution. So the challenge for mediators, arbitrators, facilitators, et cetera, is how do you adapt an ADR practice into an ODR practice? Or how do you bring technology into your practice? And one of the things that I try to do with a bit is that not all online dispute resolution is just discussion about what ODR really is and whether it has to be completely online. Opinion, the way I think that if you're using technology to fulfill any of the basic functions that you have to fulfill as a third party, you belong in the ODR tent. You're engaged in ODR, even though it might not be completely technology driven. It may be partially face-to-face, it may be using mixed technology, et cetera. But the challenge for all of us is how do you adapt that as third parties? How do you adapt that into an ODR environment in a way that is useful for and is safe for the individuals that we want to work with? So, what some of the problems that we face are pretty significant problems, but there are some opportunities as well. Probably the most telling and the most difficult problem to deal with in terms of online dispute resolution is the notion of crossing borders. And when I say crossing borders, I don't just mean national borders. I can mean state borders. I can mean city borders. I can mean venues and court borders. What we wind up doing more often in online dispute resolution than we do in face-to-face mediation or arbitration is dealing with situations where the parties may be in two different places and the third party may be in yet another place, and we are crossing all of these boundaries, and there may very well be restrictions or regulations or laws or practices in all three of those areas that do not mesh. And so one of the problems that we have as an ODR practitioner in the world that we find today is that I'm confronted with the probability as a retail mediator, so to speak, that the people who are coming to me are not in mediation all the time. That may be the first and only time they're ever in mediation. So they don't know what to expect, but they have some idea from where they're coming from as to how it's going to be handled, or perhaps maybe even have no idea. On the other hand, I may be dealing with parties who have been in mediation before, and because of where they were in mediation, they have a very strong notion of how it will be handled, and they bring that with them into the session. So we have to figure out some way to harmonize the expectations that are there from people coming from different places and different experiences. There are multiple approaches to mediation. In a book that was published back in 2012, which was a survey of mediation techniques and standards around the world, they identified as many as 50 different identifiable approaches to mediation, all of which are useful and all of which exist somewhere in the world. What that means for a mediator is that what I learned as the standard for myself may very well be quite different from the standard somewhere else, and may be very different from what my parties are expecting when they come to me. So in one way or another, in an ODR environment, we have to account for these multiple approaches that may be out there, not only for the third parties, but also for the parties as they bring their expectations in. And finally, there's some new opportunities. If you think about it, one of the things that we identified back when I did some National Science Foundation research back in the early 2000s is that that there are two extremely significant things about using ODR that are different from using regular ADR. One is I get to play around with time. I don't have people sitting at the table face to face with the pressure to get a resolution immediately. And in fact, I can do asynchronous work, I can do work over periods of time, and I can play around with the idea of what timing looks like. The other huge benefit, the other huge difference is that in an online environment, if I have a certain setup, I can actually get anonymous input from the parties. I can actually get them to tell me things that they probably would not say in open session because they can say it safely to me as a gatekeeper of information. So there are things that are useful and new and are adding to our practice. But many of the things that we get as we go into retail mediation practice with ODR are these barriers and these challenges that we face because that are out there. Now, having said all of that, one of the things that I firmly believe, and I've been working on with a colleague of mine for quite some time, is the notion of when I come into how I begin that session is very important because of those multiple expectations operating with those 50 different versions of mediation that are out there. And what we wound up doing over a period of time was to create what we call the Universal Disclosure Protocol for mediation. Best one we could think of. We don't look at these as rules, and we don't look at these as things that are mandatory and binding. We look at them as guidelines. And I'll talk a good bit about this in a moment when I walk through what we're talking about when we talk about the UDPM. But this notion of when you invite people into the session as a mediator, the way you begin that session can address those cross-border issues, can address those multiple practice issues, and can introduce some of those good things, some of those opportunities that are there, and in a way help manage the mediation session in a very important way. So why have protocols at all? Although there are 50 different ways to approach mediation around the world, an almost universal value in those mediation practices, not completely universal, but almost universal, is the idea of self-determination, that the parties have a right to engage in self-determined approaches to their own problems. One of the things that we tend to fall into when we talk about mediation and self-determination is we think about this on the back end. We think about this as once I'm confronted with a possible resolution, as a party, I have the right to say yes or no. I can self-determine whether or not I accept that resolution or whether we keep working or whether I walk away. In an online dispute resolution environment, what we argue is that it is equally important to remember self-determination at the beginning of the mediation process. When I invite people in to work with me online, if I'm using a video system, a text system, or an audio system, whatever I'm working with, when they say, yes, I will join you in that environment. I will come to that virtual meeting room that you've created, and I'll work with you there. When they say yes to that, I want to be very sure that they know what they're saying yes to. And I think in an online environment, this is maybe even more important than it is in a face-to-face environment. You know, if I invite you into a physical conference room to do mediation, I don't have to teach you how to talk. I may have to convince you that you can talk, but I don't have to teach you how to talk. When I invite you into one of my virtual rooms, maybe I really do have to teach you how to talk in a very real way. But I need to make sure that you understand what's going to happen as a result of being in that virtual space. So self-determination is a huge driver for the idea of universal protocols. The second reason we thought it was very important is to reduce cultural bias. If people are bringing cultural expectations into the mediation, and I don't on the front end have some way to identify, discuss, and reconcile those cultural differences, then I may violate cultural assumptions and norms without even knowing I'm doing it. And so for us, the idea of a universal disclosure protocol on the front end is a way to say, this is the way we'll be doing business. And what I literally do in the practice that I have is I will describe, first of all, I have meetings with the parties separately before I bring them together. And I will describe to them, this is the way that I'm thinking about conducting this mediation. These are the technologies we're going to use. This is the process I'm going to use. This is the role I expect you to play. This is the role I'm going to play. Is that okay with you? Are you comfortable with that? And if they're not comfortable with that, then I have a chance to talk about whether or not we can adjust. And so I can do that with both parties. And theoretically, what that gives you is, after that conversation, it gives you a way to harmonize the expectations based on culture or venue on both sides and bring those into the mediation so that they don't become an issue as you move forward. Transparency is, in most ethical environments, one of the things that is talked about as a standard, a baseline for ethical behavior, being transparent about the process. Once again, if we talk about universal protocols on the front end of a mediation, essentially what we're doing is we're saying, this is the transparent process. This is what you're getting into. You can understand it. And finally, this notion of protocols respects the complexity of mediation. You don't have to do it any one way. We talked a lot about the fact that it is probably a losing proposition to try to create a universal approach to mediation. I think it's a losing game, and I don't think it will ever happen. But what you can do is you can respect the complexity of mediation that's out there, and you can talk about those complex issues with the parties in such a way as it molds them into a process that the parties can believe in, trust, and are willing to join. So these are the things that drove us to think about the notion of a protocol that is on the front end of mediation. Now, one of the things that does exist already outside of any sort of protocol are agreements to mediate. Most mediators use some form of agreement to mediate. The problem with simply saying you have to have an agreement to mediate is that they can be pretty complex or they can be very simple. I have seen agreements to mediate that literally are 2 paragraphs long. I've also seen agreements to mediate that are 10 pages long. There's no standard. And what we're suggesting as part of our approach, the protocol approach, is that there are some things that you need to talk about, you need to think about, you need to include. And we don't suggest that we know exactly what you should say about them. We do suggest that these are topics that you ought to bring up. Agreements to mediate are not standard across venues, as you obviously know. And generally, they're going to be guided to some degree by local laws and regulations and requirements. But maybe even more than that, they're going to be guided by the mores, the way we do things around here, where the mediator was trained. And so there's a great deal of difference in the way the approaches to agreements to mediate based on where you are, how you were trained, and what venue you're operating within. So what to include in protocols? What are the things that we talk about? Well, first of all, there's conflict of interest. And by the way we developed these is we had interest groups literally on every continent except Antarctica. And these are working mediators, and we asked them, two questions. One, is it worth the effort to try to come up with a set of things that we should all be talking about on the front end as a protocol for opening mediation sessions? And the answer we got back to that was a universal yes. The second question we ask is, okay, if it's worthwhile to do that, what should those elements be that we would include in a protocol for how you begin mediation across borders using online dispute resolution? And those working groups came back with 6 generally accepted areas, generally accepted elements of an online protocol that we've built into the UDPM. The other thing that the groups said universally, and we didn't ask them about this, they just told us, was that we should keep it simple. That overly defining what any of these means probably is not in the interest of the third parties who want to use them, because of the fact that we have such a variety in mediation and a variety in approaches in different venues. And so these 6 are the ones that emerged from those group meetings of mediators all over the world who said these are things that are fundamental that we should be talking about and that you should adapt with your parties in the practice that you have and the expectations of the practice that they may have of you. And so conflict of interest is the first one. And just as an example of what we got into when we began talking about this, in one sense, online work and the amount of time we spend online has affected what we would talk about with conflict of interest. There are jurisdictions in the US where judges, for example, are not allowed to have friends on Facebook because having a friend on Facebook might present the impression of a conflict of interest. So when we talk about conflict of interest in an online environment, we have to talk about not only who we're related to and who we've done business with and who we know, but do we have any connections online? Another conflict of interest, for example, that is unique to online dispute resolution is if I was involved in the development of an online dispute resolution platform, and I'm now using that platform in my practice, and I'm charging my parties for my time and my work, and I've built in the cost of that online platform. Well, if I help develop it, or if I invested in its development, is the fact that I'm using that as opposed to something else a potential conflict of interest? There are different opinions about that, but one of the things that we do need to consider as we go through our disclosure in online dispute resolution is that it's not the same. It's not exactly the same as it is face-to-face. Confidentiality obviously also gets affected. If I'm face-to-face, working only in paper, if I'm talking to you and writing things down in paper and not putting anything online, I can tell you that I will maintain confidentiality of the information that you reveal in that session. I can tell you that I've destroyed the paper that I was writing on. It doesn't exist anymore. And that there is no physical way that the information can be compromised. The minute I use any technology, I can no longer make that absolute statement. So I have to talk about how I'm going to handle information, how I'm going to keep it safe, how I'm going to get rid of it when we're through with the session. So confidentiality has a different attitude altogether. What's the general process I'm going to use? And again, this goes back to the notion that there are 50 different ways to do it. And so if I describe my process to the people who are coming in to work with me as parties, and they're not comfortable with that, if I've described it adequately on the front end, I have a chance before we begin talking about their issue to make sure that the process is one with which they're comfortable. And when they say, yes, I'll join you there, they understand what they're saying yes to. Talking about the roles of everyone who's involved, the third party and the parties themselves, and whether or not there are counsel involved, and whether or not, for example, there's going to be a need for family or community to be involved in the resolution before the resolution is finalized. Again, because we're talking about an online dispute resolution process that may bring people in from various different venues, it's not automatic that the roles of everyone are going to be clear to the people who are involved. So talking about that on the front end is critical. It's obvious that you need to talk about the technology. One of the things that I teach when I teach online courses is that there's a risk damage assessment that you need to do. That I look at the information that we're going to be dealing with the parties. And the question that you ask first is, if this information were shared inappropriately, if somebody saw it who shouldn't see it, how much damage would it do? Do I not care that it would be on the front page of the paper tomorrow, or would it ruin my business? And so I have a level of risk, a level of damage rather, that I can identify. And I look at the technology then that I'm thinking about using with these parties that I'm talking to them about. And if that technology has a high risk that the information could be inadvertently shared, and I have a lot of damage that could be done if it is shared, then I probably ought not use that technology. I should find some other way to do it. So I'm trying to talk to the parties about how do we balance convenience with risk and with damage. And so, for example, if I had information that was proprietary for a business that would be very damaging if it got out, I would not use email to send any information about that material between parties, because the email technology is the easiest probably that we have to misuse. I would be willing to bet that everybody on this call has received an email they shouldn't have gotten that was supposed to go to somebody else. And I'm also willing to bet that most of us have sent emails to people that we didn't mean to send them to. So if I've got a high risk of them being accidentally misused and a high damage, then I got to find another technology. And I have to talk to my parties about that. And finally, the impact of venue. Are there local laws and regulations in any of the places where the parties happen to be that are going to drive how we should be doing business? I was recently in an mediation that was leading into arbitration if it didn't work, with participants in Canada and the United States, with the mediator in a third place in the United States. The first thing we had to deal with when we first got started was to sign an agreement that the mediation actually took place in Canada, even though most of the people who were involved were not in Canada, because the parties wanted to be sure that it was a Canadian court that would deal with it if there were a violation of the agreement. And so this notion of, what difference does it make where we are, we need to talk about on the front end. So if you put all of these together, the Universal Protocol doesn't tell you what to say about any of them. What it does say is that these are fundamental issues that in an online dispute resolution environment particularly, we should be mindful of, and that we should be talking about to the parties that we're about to deal with. And if you wanted more information about the Universal Disclosure Protocol, there are a couple of things that I'll give these PowerPoints to your hosts, and they can post them. But there's an article in the 7 Keys book, there's an article in the International Journal, and this is my email on the screen. And you can find them just by typing in udpm.org. At this point, stop sharing and come back. We're about 40 minutes. So any comments that anyone has? You can drop them into the chat box if you'd like, or you can just speak up.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for that interesting presentation. I did get quite a few points. So I don't know if anyone has a question or comment or would like to make any comment about the presentation. You could either raise up your hand or drop the questions in the comments, in the chat box rather.
And if not, we'll.
Okay, thank you very
done.
much, Daniel, for the session. We really enjoyed it. We hope to have you come again sometime soon.
And well, thank you very much for the invitation. I appreciate it. And again, if you want any more information, udpm.org is the website, and you'll have my email, and please feel free to contact me if you wish.
I have a light because
Okay.
I recall that while making the presentation, the issue of culture was raised. And I know that while preparing the UPDM protocols, that was a big issue, particularly where you have people from different cultures. And how you deal with the culture difference online is obviously very different from how you deal with the culture differences where you meet face to face. So I just wanted you to maybe shed a bit more light on that.
Sure, I'd be happy to. I do a lot. Well, first of all, I would say that it's probably impossible to do a monocultural mediation these days, because even if you have people who look alike, speak the same language, come from the same place, it's very likely that there will be some cultural difference among those people. There are lots of different definitions of culture. And the one that I use when I'm doing my training and teaching is a very simple definition of culture. And culture in a mediation context, culture is the way we do things around here. It's a guide for behavior. It's how I'm going to operate, how I'm going to interpret what you do, and how I'm going to behave, and how I expect things to happen. And so my conviction is that when you're talking about online dispute resolution, you increase the opportunity for there to be radical differences in cultural expectations simply because we've expanded the venues that we deal with. We always deal with these issues, but I do think it's fair to say that in online dispute resolution, you have the opportunity to deal with radical differences more often. And what I've always done in my practice is I want to find out what the expectations are of the parties that I'm dealing with about how we're going to literally do things, how we're going to do things in this session, because that to me will reveal any cultural expectations that are there. The ones that I deal with most often, because of the kind of practice I have, is that you bring people into a virtual space like you bring them into a physical space. And there's in a lot of mediation training, there's an expectation that you will deal with the parties who are at the table, and they're going to be the ones who are going to make a decision. And there's some pressure for us to get the deal done. Well, I deal with a lot of mediation where that's absolutely not going to happen. That there are people who are not at the table. There are people who are in the family or in the community or engaged in other sorts of ways who are not there physically or virtually, who are going to be part of the final decision about whether that resolution is going to be workable. And so I can find out those kind of things when I talk to the parties on the front end. And if one party has one expectation and another party has another expectation, I can, at the very least, I can explain to both parties where the differences are and how I'm going to deal with those. And maybe I can even get a consensus among those parties about how we should do it. But for me, the idea of online dispute resolution simply expands the possibility that there are going to be differing cultural expectations. And obviously what I want to do is I want to, if I can, to the best of my ability, I want to honor those cultural expectations. It also puts me in a position where if there is something that is expected by the parties that they will not deal without, they have to have it, and that I'm uncomfortable with that, then maybe I'm not the right mediator. So in one sense, it's also a test of whether or not I'm the appropriate person to be dealing with them if I can't be comfortable with what they're asking me to do. So, yeah, it's an interesting conundrum that you get into, is that, there is a culture of mediation, and the culture of mediation differs depending on how you were trained and where you are. But in the United States, for example, the culture of mediation says, okay, the way you start is you identify the issue and you very clearly state the issue. Then you go on to what the interests are, then you go on to options, and then you go on to trying to put those options into a resolution. Well, a lot of the people that I deal with, if you start out by clearly defining the issue, what you're actually doing is saying that somebody did something wrong, and that's very uncomfortable in some cultural situations. And so I wind up, if you looked at some of the mediation that I do, you would think, you'd wonder whether it was mediation at all, because it looks like we're just having a conversation. And I've done mediation among certain parties where at the end of the day, nobody ever said who did anything wrong, and nobody ever said exactly what was going to happen, but everybody knew what was going to happen, and everybody knew that it was going to be taken care of. So the cultural aspects of it mean for an online mediator that I've got to be willing to flex myself. And I'm asking the parties to flex a little bit by coming into mediation, but I've got to be able to flex myself to deal with those parties in a way that's comfortable culturally. So I don't know if that's just rambling or if that answers your question, but that's, to me, it's one of the real challenges for any mediator, but it's a real challenge, especially I think for online mediators.
Thank you.
Others in the chat, I see it says, will literacy be an issue in cultural differences? The answer is absolutely yes, and it's literacy in more than one way. Literacy in terms of the ability to express oneself, and it could be the language that you're speaking, because obviously very often we have multiple languages being spoken in mediation. It can be your technology literacy, because what we want is we want to create as best we can an environment where everybody's comfortable. And if I have one person who's used to being online all the time, who's very cultural or technology literate, and another person who's very smart, very intelligent, very well spoken, but is not very comfortable with the technology, then I've created an imbalance that I have to deal with in one way or another. So yes, the idea of literacy is something, if it's there, I want to know about it as a third party, and I want to be able to say, this is how I'm going to handle it. And I want to do that not in a way, I wouldn't do that first in an open session. I wouldn't say to somebody, oh, gee, you're having problems, how are we going to handle that? That's one of the reasons why in an online dispute resolution environment, particularly for me, I want to talk to the parties individually first before we get them together. And I want that first conversation not to be about their issue, but about literally how are we going to do our business, so that they're able to tell me what they're comfortable with, what they can do, what they can't do, and we can organize the session in a way that's going to work for them. And then when I bring them together, we can talk about their issue. But I want to make sure they're comfortable first, and that I understand what the issues are first before we ever come together online.
Thank you. Andre, you have the floor.
I do, thank you. Cultural differences are important, but then there are also many common attributes in my experience, because people are people, and often there is much that binds you no matter what part of the world, which brings me to my question. That is, I seem to recall that the American Bar Association was working on a project, a protocol for mediators practicing in the US. What happened? Was there such a project? And if so, what's happened to it?
Yes, there was such a project. I was I guess still the chair of one of the working groups. I want to say this as gently as I can. The bureaucracy of the American Bar Association moves at a glacial pace. We've been working on this for, I don't want to exaggerate, at least 3 years. And I think we're nearing actually issuing some statements about guidance. I was the chair of the online dispute resolution private practice group that was putting information into the overall report. And all facetiousness aside, I think they're just about to issue the guidance. So you should be looking for that. I would hope sometime this year. I'm not kidding when I say that. It doesn't happen fast. As you might imagine, there were a variety of opinions about how much specificity should be included, a variety of opinions about just the content. And the debates have been interesting, but they've also been long. So,
well, keep us posted, I think, would be the request from my side.
Yep, I will do that. Any other questions or comments? I think I see one. Joanne?
Yes. The question I wanted to ask, when I saw Andre here, I thought, well, I should have asked that question when I was talking to Andre. Something about, yeah, cultures differ all over the world, but one common thing among disputants or people that come around for mediation is that each party is hoping the other party is just going to accept to negotiate off their rights. I know that we try to encourage them to think need, not entitlement. Now, when you notice such thing or such a tendency among parties in mediation, what strategy do you apply? Do you have magic words for such situations?
There are no magic words. I will tell you, however, that brain science can tell us a lot about this. You are more likely to listen to, respect, and discuss with people when your pain and anger buttons are not pushed, when your pleasure buttons are pushed. And when your pain and anger buttons are pushed mentally, that happens quickly. You react deeply, and it doesn't go away quickly. And so, one of the things that I sort of preach is that the way you begin the conversation will have a lot to do with where the conversation goes, which is why I do not start with a statement of the problem. I start with other things altogether. I am a believer in the human needs theory approach to third-party work. I think there are certain things that across cultures, no matter where you are, things that are valuable to people who come into mediation. I think most of us, they may not be universal, but I think they're nearly universal. People who come into mediation want to feel that they're in a safe and secure environment. People who come into mediation want to feel that they're respected, that there's some self-respect and respect. And people who come into mediation want to think that they're getting into something that makes sense. It's not chaotic, that there's a reason that we're doing what we're doing. And so what I try to do is I try to craft approaches to mediation that show respect and have people feel that they're being respected and they're being treated well. I try to show them that there is a structure that we're going to deal with. That's why I talk to them so much on the front end about how we're going to do business. Is they know what's coming, they know what's going to happen, and I try to sort of touch those buttons that are the pleasure buttons and the human needs buttons. And so one of the things that I try to do when I do my initial conversations with the parties separately is if I'm hearing them using language that I know very well is going to touch those anger buttons on the other party, I won't tell them what they can say and not say, but I may very well ask them, well, okay, if you say it that way, how do you think the other side's going to react? If it was said to you that way, how would you react? Is there a way you can say it so that it's honest and you don't compromise what you think, but which invites a conversation as opposed to laying out a side, laying out a position? And so for me, the way I try to handle it is, before we ever get to the idea of why are you fighting with each other, I try to make sure they understand that the environment that we're in is one where they're going to be respected, they're going to have a chance to talk, there's going to be a process that we use that they can recognize, and at the end of the day, they're going to be able to make choices that are independent choices. So if I can do that on the front end before we ever start talking to each other about the problem, then I'm helping them push those pleasure buttons as opposed to pushing the anger buttons. And to me, that's a huge step. That's where I try to get to.
Thank you very much, Daniel.
Yeah. Well, I just said one more quick thing. One of the reasons why in most mediation training, they tell you to deal with interests and not positions, is that anytime, humans are humans. I'm going to walk into that mediation session and I'm going to have an idea in my head of what I want, right? And I'm going to, and if I say this is the way I think it should be done, I can almost guarantee you that that's not going to be the way the other party sees it. And so to some degree, every position that you start out with, when you state the position, to some degree, that is a threatening position to the other party, because it says very subtly, what you think is wrong, this is the right way to do it. And their immediate reaction is going to be an anger or pain reaction, which is going to say, well, the hell with you. That is not the way it is. I know the way it is. This is the way it should be. And when you have that start, you've now pushed both of their anger buttons, and you're going to have to walk back from there. So what you want to try to do is not have them start out by putting a hard position on the table, but talking about things that are common, things that bring them into the conversation together, things that make them listen to one another. If you can do that, then you've got a good step toward making resolution.
Okay, thank you very much, Daniel. I would like to call Andre, our advisory board member, to appreciate our speaker for today.
Sorry, I didn't quite, I caught my name, but I didn't catch much else there.
I didn't catch that either.
That's probably
I just wanted you to say thank you to Daniel for being...
On behalf of ODR Africa.
Okay. Daniel, firstly, thank you for your time, because the one thing that we believe is that there's a great deal to be learned from the US, from UNCITRAL, from Europe, from countries like Singapore. And it's always good for people like yourselves to come along and share experiences. It's also interesting to hear you complain about what you call the glacial pace at which things move in your legal system. Because let me give you the assurance, compared to most African countries, you ain't seen nothing yet as far as. And it is therefore encouraging to hear all the work that's still happening there. And it's encouraging to have these kind of opportunities of exchanging ideas and that sort of thing. And I'm sure that many of us have learned things. Many of us look forward. Did you say your book is out towards the end of the year? Yeah, it's with the desk editor now. I'm hoping it'll come out within the next couple of months. Oh, you might have concluded 14 sales this evening. You might have. Well, look, I would just say that I appreciate your comments. Thank you. One of the things that we learn from each other, and I'm not just saying this, I really believe it. I've been doing this work a long time, I have probably made every mistake you can make. I've literally. And the question is not, are you going to do it right all the time? If the question is, how disastrously are you going to do it wrong every now and then? But really the question is, do you learn from that? And is there something you can pick up from the mistake that you make that you can incorporate yourself and then pass along to somebody else and say, for goodness sake, don't do that. I did that and it didn't work, so don't do that. So that's why I enjoy doing the things like this. I love talking to people about what they're doing, because I invariably learn something that is useful to me. So I hope something that I said was useful to you guys. And again, if you'll have my email address, if you want to get in touch, please feel free to do so. Very much so. And thank you. Thank you very much for your time. Sure. Goodbye, all.
Goodbye. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Do have a lovely evening.
Thank you.